The autumn morning arrived cold and gray over Springfield, Missouri, bringing with it the kind of persistent drizzle that made everything look older and more melancholic. Dr. Sarah Mitchell pulled her coat tighter as she walked through the glass doors of the Southwest Missouri Historical Society, her boots leaving wet prints on the polished floor. At 42, Sarah had spent nearly 2 decades studying Ozark frontier photography, but nothing had prepared her for what she was about to discover in the archives that morning. The building smelled of old paper, leather, and the faint mustiness that clings to places where history is carefully preserved. Sarah greeted the archivist, a kindly woman named Helen who had worked there for 30 years, and made her way to the research room where boxes of recently donated materials awaited examination. These items had come from the estate of Margaret Thornton, a woman who had passed away at 97, leaving behind trunks filled with family documents, letters, and photographs dating back to the mid-1800s. Sarah settled into her usual spot by the window, where gray light filtered through the rain-streaked glass, and carefully opened the first box. Inside, wrapped in yellowed tissue paper, lay dozens of photographs mounted on cardboard backing, their surfaces cracked with age but remarkably well preserved. She handled each one with white cotton gloves, documenting every image with meticulous notes about composition, photographic technique, and historical context. Most of the photographs showed typical scenes from late 19th century Ozark life: stoic farmers standing beside rough-hewn cabins, women in long dark dresses gathered for church socials, children posed stiffly in their Sunday best. But it was the photograph near the bottom of the second box that made Sarah pause, her breath catching slightly as she lifted it into the light. The image showed a family of 5 arranged in front of a simple wooden house with a stone chimney. The photograph bore the photographer's stamp on the back: J. Hartwell, traveling photographer, October 1891. The family appeared prosperous by Ozark standards of the time. The father stood tall and stern on the left, his hand resting on the shoulder of a boy who looked about 10 years old. The mother sat in a straight-backed chair at the center, her face bearing the kind of premature aging that hard frontier life brought to women. 2 daughters completed the group, an older girl of perhaps 15 standing behind her mother, and a younger girl, maybe 8 or 9, seated on a small stool at her mother's feet. At first glance, it was an unremarkable portrait, the kind that filled countless albums across rural America during that era. The family wore their best clothing, faces arranged in the serious expressions that long exposure times demanded. But something about the younger girl drew Sarah's attention. While everyone else in the photograph stared directly at the camera with varying degrees of discomfort, the girl's gaze was directed downward, focused intently on something she held cradled in her small hands. Sarah pulled out her magnifying glass and leaned closer. The photograph's resolution was remarkable for its age, crisp enough to show the texture of the wooden planks behind the family and the individual buttons on the father's vest. But what the girl held remained frustratingly unclear at this magnification, appearing as a dark, rounded shape that could have been anything from a doll to a piece of fruit. She made detailed notes about the photograph, including the family's clothing, which suggested they were reasonably well off, the style of the house, which indicated German or Scots-Irish heritage common to the region, and the season, which the bare trees in the background confirmed as late autumn. Then she carefully photographed the image with her high-resolution digital camera, taking multiple shots from different angles, and moved on to document the rest of the collection. 3 days later, back in her small office at the university where she taught American history, Sarah was processing her photographs when she decided to examine the Thornton family portrait more closely. She uploaded the high-resolution image to her computer and began zooming in, section by section, studying details invisible to the naked eye. She examined the father's calloused hands, the mother's wedding ring worn thin, the older daughter's carefully mended dress collar. Then she moved to the younger girl. Sarah increased the magnification, focusing on the object in the child's hands. As the pixels resolved into clearer detail, she felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the temperature in her office. What she had assumed was a simple toy or keepsake revealed itself to be something far more unusual and significant. The girl was holding what appeared to be a small leather-bound book, its pages visible where her small fingers held it open. But it wasn't just any book. Even through the sepia tones of the old photograph, Sarah could make out writing on the visible pages, cramped handwriting that covered every available space. More striking still was the girl's expression, now clearly visible in the enhanced image. Her face showed none of the blank compliance of the other family members. Instead, her features held an intensity that seemed almost out of place in one so young, a fierce concentration that spoke of profound emotional investment in whatever that small book contained. Sarah sat back in her chair, her mind racing. In her years of studying frontier photography, she had learned to read the small details that revealed larger truths about people's lives. Clothing could indicate economic status, possessions could suggest occupation or interests, but expressions and gestures often told the most compelling stories. This little girl, seated at her mother's feet in what should have been a formal family portrait, had chosen to focus not on presenting herself to the camera but on whatever words filled that small book. She spent the next hour researching the Thornton family. Estate records showed that the property had been in the family since 1873, when Heinrich Thornton, a German immigrant, had purchased 200 acres in the hills north of Springfield. Census records from 1890 listed Heinrich Thornton, age 43, farmer, his wife Mary, age 39, and their children, Anna, 14, Johann, 9, and Emma, 7. The family in the photograph perfectly matched these descriptions, allowing Sarah to identify each person by name, but it was the later records that brought Sarah's investigation to an abrupt and tragic halt. The 1900 census showed only Heinrich, Mary, and Anna still living at the Ozark homestead. Both younger children, Johann and Emma, were listed as deceased. According to county death records, Johann had died in 1893 from scarlet fever, a common killer of children in that era. But Emma's entry was different. The cause of death was listed simply as consumption, and the date was March 1892, barely 5 months after the photograph had been taken. Sarah looked again at the image of little Emma Thornton, seated on her stool with that mysterious book cradled in her hands and that expression of fierce determination on her young face. Had she known, even then, that her time was limited? Was that why the book seemed to hold such importance for her? And what had become of it after her death? Over the following weeks, Sarah dove deeper into her research, driven by questions that kept her awake at night. She contacted descendants of the Thornton family, studied property records, and examined every document in Margaret Thornton's estate collection. She learned that Heinrich had been a respected member of the German farming community in the Ozarks, known for his excellent apple orchards and his insistence on educating his children despite the hardships of frontier life. Mary had been the daughter of Scots-Irish settlers, blending her Presbyterian faith with her husband's Lutheran traditions to create a household that neighbors remembered as both strict and surprisingly scholarly for that time and place. The more Sarah learned, the more that photograph haunted her. She had examined thousands of 19th century images, but few had affected her so profoundly. There was something about Emma's downward gaze, the protective way her small hands cradled that book, and the knowledge that within months of that photograph being taken, she would be gone forever. It felt less like examining a historical artifact and more like peering through a window into a moment of profound personal significance that had been frozen in silver and paper more than a century ago. Sarah reached out to colleagues in forensic photography and historical document analysis. She sent them high-resolution scans of the photograph, asking if modern technology might reveal more about what Emma held. While she waited for their responses, she continued researching Emma's short life, piecing together fragments from letters, diary entries of neighbors, and church records. A picture began to emerge of an unusual child, one whom the local schoolteacher had described in a letter as possessed of an intelligence and curiosity quite remarkable, particularly given her tender years and frequent bouts of illness. The illness, it seemed, had been with Emma for most of her life. References in family letters suggested she had always been frail, subject to fevers and breathing difficulties that kept her confined to the house for weeks at a time. In an era before modern medicine, families learned to expect that not all children would survive to adulthood, particularly those who showed signs of weakness. But Emma, despite her physical fragility, had possessed a fierce determination to learn, to read, to write, and to understand the world beyond her family's isolated farm. 2 months after she had first discovered the photograph, Sarah received an email from Dr. James Chen, a specialist in photographic enhancement and historical image analysis at the Library of Congress. He had used sophisticated software to enhance and clarify the image of Emma's book, and his findings were remarkable. The writing visible on those pages was indeed a child's handwriting, but the content suggested something far more sophisticated than simple schoolwork. Dr. Chen had been able to make out several phrases, and what he found had prompted him to recommend that Sarah pursue further investigation into what he called a potentially significant historical document. The phrases he had deciphered included, "Today I saw the red-tailed hawk circle above the north field 3 times, Papa says the winter will be hard but the trees know, and most intriguingly, I am writing everything down so that when I am gone, someone will remember." These fragments suggested that Emma's small book was a journal, a personal record of her observations and thoughts, written by a child who seemed aware that her time might be limited. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes as she read Dr. Chen's report. This wasn't just a historical curiosity anymore. It was the story of a little girl who, facing illness and perhaps intuiting her own mortality, had decided to leave something behind to ensure that her thoughts and observations would outlast her brief life. The photograph captured not just a family portrait but a moment of profound determination, Emma choosing to hold that journal in the formal photograph, making sure it would be recorded, preserved, remembered. But where was the journal now? That question consumed Sarah as autumn turned to winter in Springfield. She contacted every descendant she could locate, searched through additional archives, and even visited the site of the old Thornton homestead, now subdivided into modern housing developments. The original house was long gone, demolished in the 1950s, but Sarah stood on the hillside where it had once stood, looking out over the Ozark landscape that Emma would have known, and felt an almost physical connection to the child whose story she was trying to uncover. The breakthrough came in late December, just before the university closed for the winter holiday. Helen, the archivist at the Historical Society, called Sarah's office with news. While cataloging more items from Margaret Thornton's estate, she had found a small metal box tucked into the bottom of a trunk that had initially appeared empty. The box was locked, rusty with age, and bore no markings. But something about its size and shape had reminded Helen of Sarah's search for Emma's journal. Sarah drove through a light snowfall to the Historical Society, her heart pounding with anticipation and dread. What if the box contained the journal? What if it didn't? What would it mean to finally read the words of a child who had been dead for more than 130 years? Helen met her at the door, the small box already waiting on the research table. The box was roughly 6 inches by 4 inches, made of tin that had oxidized to a mottled brown. The lock was rusted shut, but Helen had called a locksmith who had managed to open it without damaging the contents. Sarah pulled on her cotton gloves and carefully lifted the lid. Inside, wrapped in a faded piece of silk that might once have been blue, lay a small leather-bound book, its pages yellowed and brittle with age but miraculously preserved by the airtight seal of the metal box. Sarah's hands trembled as she carefully removed the book and opened it to the first page. There, in a child's careful handwriting, were the words, "This journal belongs to Emma Catherine Thornton. I am 7 years old. I am writing down important things so they will not be forgotten. October 15, 1891. The date was just days before the family photograph had been taken. Sarah turned the pages with infinite care, reading entries that spanned from October 1891 to February 1892. The journal was Emma's attempt to document her world, to capture in words the sights, sounds, and experiences of her daily life on an Ozark farm in the final decade of the 19th century. Some entries were simple observations about weather or farm animals. Others revealed a child grappling with questions far beyond her years, pondering the nature of time, memory, and what it meant to leave something behind. But it was the final entries, written in January and February of 1892, that brought the full weight of Emma's story into focus. Her handwriting became shakier, the entries shorter and sometimes confused, as illness took its toll. Yet even as she weakened, Emma continued to write, determined to complete what she had started. Her last entry, dated February 28, 1892, was barely legible, the letters wavering across the page. It read simply, "I am very tired now. But I am glad I wrote everything down. Now you know I was here." Emma had died 2 weeks later, on March 14, 1892, at the age of 8 years and 5 months. To understand Emma Thornton's journal and the photograph that preserved her image for posterity, one had to understand the world she inhabited during her brief life. The Ozark region in the late 19th century was a place of stark beauty and harsh realities, where families carved lives out of rocky hillsides and dense forests, isolated from the rapid industrialization transforming much of America. The Thornton farm sat on a hillside in Stone County, Missouri, about 20 miles north of Springfield. Heinrich Thornton had chosen the location carefully in 1873, seeking land that offered good water, defensible high ground, and enough flat acreage for farming. The house he built was typical of German immigrant construction, sturdy logs chinked with clay and limestone, a steep roof to shed snow, and a massive stone fireplace that served as both heat source and cooking hearth. By the time Emma was born in 1883, Heinrich had expanded the original cabin, adding a second room for sleeping and a root cellar for food storage. Life on the Thornton farm followed the rhythms of seasons and survival that had governed farming communities for millennia. Spring meant planting corn, beans, and squash in the cleared bottomland while Heinrich tended his growing apple orchard on the south-facing slope. Summer brought endless days of weeding, thinning, and protecting crops from deer, birds, and insects. Autumn was harvest time, when every member of the family worked from dawn until dark to gather and preserve food for winter. And winter itself was a time of maintenance, repair, and the kind of close confinement that tested even the strongest family bonds. That Emma's earliest memories, as recorded in her journal, were filled with sensory details that brought that vanished world to vivid life. She wrote about the smell of her mother's bread baking in the outdoor oven on summer mornings, the feel of cool well water on her hands during hot afternoons, and the sound of her father's voice singing old German songs while he worked in the orchard. She described the taste of wild blackberries picked along the creek, the itch of homespun wool dresses in winter, and the particular quality of silence that settled over the hills after a snowfall. But Emma's world was also shaped by hardship and limitation. Medical care was primitive and distant. The nearest doctor lived in Springfield, a day's journey by wagon over rutted roads that became impassable in bad weather. Families treated illnesses with home remedies passed down through generations. Willow bark tea for fever, honey and whiskey for coughs, poultices of bread mold for infected wounds. Many treatments worked through folk wisdom that predated scientific understanding. Others did nothing at all. Children died from diseases that would become easily treatable within a generation: diphtheria, scarlet fever, measles, whooping cough, and the slow, consuming illness of tuberculosis that people called consumption. Emma had been born during a difficult winter, arriving 6 weeks early according to family letters. She was small and frail from the beginning, prone to respiratory infections that left her wheezing and feverish. Mary Thornton nursed her daughter through crisis after crisis, sitting up through long nights with Emma cradled against her chest, helping her breathe through steaming kettles of water infused with pine needles. Neighbors wondered if the child would survive her first year, then her second. But Emma persisted, growing slowly but remaining always smaller and frailier than other children her age. Her fragility meant that she could not help with many farm chores that occupied her older sister Anna and younger brother Johann. While they worked in the fields or tended animals, Emma stayed close to the house, helping her mother with lighter tasks: shelling peas, churning butter, collecting eggs from the henhouse. But her inability to participate fully in the physical labor of farm life gave her something precious: time to think, to observe, and eventually, to read and write. Heinrich Thornton believed strongly in education, unusual for a farmer of his time and place. He himself had learned to read and write in Germany before immigrating to America in 1870, and he was determined that his children would have the same advantages. When Anna was 6, Heinrich had hired a traveling teacher to spend 3 months on the farm, teaching his daughter basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. The teacher, a young woman named Elizabeth Corwin, had stayed with the family and taught Anna during the winter months when farm work slowed. 4 years later, when Emma was 5, Miss Corwin returned to begin the younger girl's education that Emma's journal revealed that she had taken to learning with an almost desperate enthusiasm. While Anna saw reading and writing as useful skills and nothing more, Emma discovered in books a vast world beyond the confines of the farm. Miss Corwin brought with her a trunk of books donated by families in Springfield. Primers, McGuffey readers, a Bible, collections of moral tales and simplified classics. Emma read voraciously, returning to favorites multiple times and asking questions that often surprised her teacher. In an entry from November 1891, Emma wrote about a conversation with Miss Corwin regarding a book of natural history. Miss Corwin showed me pictures of birds that live in South America. She says they are so bright you cannot look at them in the sun. I wonder if they know they are beautiful. Papa's apple trees do not know they are beautiful, but I think they are. Maybe beauty is something we see, not something things have. These philosophical musings, sophisticated beyond Emma's years, appeared throughout the journal alongside more typical childish observations about farm animals, family dynamics, and daily routines. Emma seemed aware that she saw the world differently than her siblings. She wrote about feeling separate, observing rather than fully participating, as though her illness had placed her slightly outside the normal flow of family life. The journal also revealed Emma's complex relationship with her mother. Mary Thornton emerges from Emma's entries as a woman worn down by the relentless demands of frontier life but fiercely protective of her fragile daughter. Emma described her mother's hands, rough and reddened from constant work, braiding her hair with surprising gentleness. She recorded conversations in which Mary talked about her own childhood in Tennessee, before the Civil War had torn her family apart and sent them fleeing west to Missouri. These moments of connection appeared frequently in the journal, suggesting that Emma and her mother shared a bond strengthened by Emma's frequent illnesses. In contrast, Emma's relationship with her father was more distant. Heinrich appears in the journal as a stern but generally kind figure, preoccupied with the constant demands of the farm. Emma described him as always working, always thinking about the crops and animals and weather. But she also recorded moments of unexpected tenderness, Heinrich carrying her to the orchard when she was too weak to walk, letting her sit in the shade while he pruned the apple trees and told her their German names. She wrote about his singing, how his voice would carry across the hillsides on quiet evenings, old songs from his homeland that she didn't understand but found comforting nonetheless. Her older sister Anna was a more complicated presence. 14 years old when the photograph was taken, Anna was already being courted by a neighbor's son and clearly eager to begin her own adult life. Emma's entries suggest a mixture of admiration and hurt regarding her older sister. Anna is so pretty and strong. She can do everything Mama does and more. Sometimes I think she wishes I was strong too, or maybe wishes I was not here at all so she would not have to worry about me. Despite this perceived distance, Emma also recorded moments when Anna read to her during illness or brought her small gifts from town. A ribbon, a piece of peppermint candy, once a small cloth doll that Emma treasured. Her brother Johann appears least frequently in the journal, perhaps because at 9 years old, he was fully engaged in learning farm work alongside his father and had little time for a younger sister confined mostly to the house. But Emma's affection for him was clear in the entries that mentioned him, Johann bringing her interesting rocks from the creek, Johann letting her hold a baby rabbit he'd found, Johann defending her when neighboring children made comments about her frailty. The journal also provided a window into the broader community that surrounded the Thornton farm. Every few weeks, families would gather for church services held in a neighbor's barn, as the community was too small and scattered to support a church building. Emma described these gatherings with particular attention to the social dynamics. Which women were friends, which men held grudges, which children were kind and which were cruel. She noted that some families looked at her with pity, others with barely concealed belief that her continued illness was somehow a judgment or a burden her family deserved for unnamed sins. This social isolation, born from both her illness and the judgmental attitudes of some neighbors, seemed to intensify Emma's determination to document her world. In an entry from December 1891, she wrote, "Mrs. Cooper looked at me today at church and whispered to Mrs. Hughes. They think I cannot hear but I can. Mrs. Cooper said God sometimes takes the weak ones because they are too pure for this world. I do not think I am too pure. I think I am just sick. But maybe if I am going to die, I should write down what I have seen so that people will know I was here and I was paying attention." This awareness of her own mortality, remarkable in a 7-year-old child, appeared with increasing frequency as autumn turned to winter in 1891. Emma wrote about the changing seasons with the attention of someone who understood that she might not see another cycle of the year. She described the last leaves falling from the oak trees, the way frost transformed spider webs into jeweled nets across the grass, the first snow falling silently in the night to cover the world in white. Each observation carried a weight of attention, as though Emma was trying to memorize everything, to carry it with her wherever she might go. The photograph itself, taken in late October 1891, merited a full entry in Emma's journal. She described how J. Hartwell, the traveling photographer, had arrived at the farm with his wagon full of equipment. Heinrich had paid him $5, a significant expense, to create a family portrait. Emma wrote about the preparation, her mother washing everyone's hair, pressing their best clothes, scrubbing faces and hands until they shone. Anna had been allowed to wear her one piece of jewelry, a cameo brooch inherited from her grandmother. Johann had his hair slicked down with pomade that made him smell like flowers, which he hated, but Emma's focus in describing the photograph was not on these details. Instead, she wrote extensively about her decision to hold her journal in the picture. Mama wanted me to hold my doll, but I said no. I wanted to hold my journal because it is the most important thing I have. Mr. Hartwell said I should look at the camera like everyone else, but I wanted to look at my journal. Mama said it was foolish, but Papa said to let me do as I wished. So I held my journal and I looked at the words I had written and I thought about how someday, after I'm gone, maybe someone will see this picture and wonder what I was reading. This extraordinary self-awareness, this deliberate choice to ensure that her journal would be documented and remembered, spoke to Emma's determination to leave a mark on the world despite her brief time in it. She continued, Miss Corwin says that writing is a kind of immortality. She says that people who write books can live forever in their words. I do not have enough time to write a book, but I have my journal, and now there is a photograph of me holding it. So maybe someday, someone will find both and know that Emma Thornton lived and wrote down what she saw. Through December and into January, Emma's entries continued, though they became shorter and sometimes less coherent as her illness progressed. She wrote about Christmas, when her mother made special cookies using precious sugar and spices. She described the way ice formed in intricate patterns on the windows, how the house grew so cold at night that she could see her breath even under layers of quilts. She noted that Johann had grown 3 inches since summer and now his sleeves were too short. She recorded that Anna's young man, Thomas Müller, had come to speak with Heinrich about courting intentions and how excited Anna had been, though trying to hide it. But woven through these ordinary observations were increasingly frequent references to her deteriorating health. I coughed so much last night that I could not sleep. Mama sat with me and held me up so I could breathe. She sang songs from when she was a girl. I could feel her crying even though she tried to be quiet. I do not want her to be sad. But I cannot stop coughing. And later, Dr. Morrison came from Springfield today. He listened to my chest with his instrument and talked to Papa outside. I know what they said even though they think I do not. Dr. Morrison said there is fluid in my lungs and I should be kept warm and given broth. He gave Mama some brown medicine that tastes terrible. It does not help. January faded into February, and Emma's handwriting grew shakier, the entries more sporadic. She wrote about dreams that seemed more real than waking life. She described seeing the red-tailed hawk that had fascinated her all autumn, circling above the snow-covered fields. She mentioned that Miss Corwin had come to visit and had read to her from a book of poetry, though Emma could not remember which poems afterward. Her final entries were brief, sometimes just a few words. Johann brought me water from the cold creek. It tasted like stones in winter. And Anna sat with me today. She is crying. I told her not to be sad. I said I wrote everything down. And finally, on February 28, 1892, I am very tired now. But I am glad I wrote everything down. Now you know I was here. Emma lingered for 2 more weeks after that final entry, growing weaker each day until she could no longer hold a pen or even speak clearly. On March 14, 1892, with her mother holding her and her father kneeling beside the bed reciting prayers in German, Emma Catherine Thornton died. She was 8 years old and 5 months. The cause of death was officially listed as consumption, what we would now recognize as tuberculosis, a disease that would continue killing thousands of children every year until the development of antibiotics and vaccines in the 20th century. After discovering Emma's journal, Dr. Sarah Mitchell spent months working to understand the full context of the child's life and death. The journal itself was a remarkable artifact, but Sarah believed it deserved more than simply being catalogued and shelved. Emma had written with the explicit hope that someone would read her words and remember her. Sarah felt a responsibility to honor that hope by bringing Emma's story to light and understanding what it revealed about childhood, mortality, and resilience in 19th century America. Sarah began by having the journal professionally conserved. The pages were carefully stabilized, photographed at high resolution, and transcribed with painstaking attention to Emma's handwriting, spelling, and punctuation. The conservation process revealed additional details. The leather binding was made from repurposed horse tack, suggesting that Heinrich had crafted the journal specifically for Emma from materials he had on hand. The paper was of surprisingly good quality, likely purchased in Springfield specifically for this purpose. And hidden between two pages near the end of the journal was a pressed flower, a delicate purple violet that someone had carefully preserved, probably Mary Thornton as a keepsake of her lost daughter. With the journal transcribed and preserved, Sarah turned her attention to contextualizing Emma's experience within the broader patterns of childhood illness and mortality in the late 19th century. She consulted medical historians, specialists in tuberculosis history, and experts in frontier medicine. What emerged was a sobering picture of childhood in an era before modern medical care. Tuberculosis, or consumption as it was commonly called, was one of the leading causes of death in the United States throughout the 1800s and into the early 1900s. The disease, caused by bacteria that primarily attack the lungs, could take years to kill its victims, particularly in the slow-progressing form that affected many children. Symptoms included persistent cough, fever, weight loss, and the gradual accumulation of fluid in the lungs that made breathing increasingly difficult. There was no effective treatment. Doctors recommended fresh air, nourishing food, and rest, but these measures did little to halt the disease's progress. Families could only watch and provide comfort as their loved ones slowly weakened. For a child like Emma, born with a predisposition toward respiratory illness and growing up in the damp, cold climate of the Ozark winters, tuberculosis was nearly inevitable if exposed to the bacteria. The disease was highly contagious, spread through coughing and close contact, which meant that once it entered a household, multiple family members often became infected. Yet mysteriously, not everyone exposed to tuberculosis contracted it, and not everyone who contracted it died from it. Emma's siblings apparently remained healthy, though Johann would die 2 years later from an entirely different illness, scarlet fever, that swept through the Ozark communities in 1893. Sarah also researched the broader social context of childhood death in the 1890s. She found that while infant mortality was high, with nearly 1 in 5 children dying before their first birthday, those who survived early childhood still faced significant risks. Infectious diseases like diphtheria, measles, whooping cough, and scarlet fever claimed thousands of children every year. Farm accidents were common. Malnutrition weakened children's immune systems, making them more vulnerable to every passing illness. And medical care, when available at all, was often ineffective or even harmful by modern standards. Families in Emma's time and place had a different relationship with death than contemporary Americans do. Death was not hidden away in hospitals and funeral homes but was a visible presence in daily life. Most people died at home, cared for by family members. Children regularly attended the funerals of siblings, cousins, and neighbors. Cemetery visits were common family outings. This familiarity with death did not mean that grief was any less profound, but it did mean that people had different ways of coping with loss and preparing for it. Emma's awareness of her own mortality, which might seem shocking or tragic to modern readers, would have been less unusual in her own time. Children understood that some people died young. They saw it happen. They heard adults talking about who was sick and who was unlikely to recover. And particularly bright, observant children like Emma could not help but understand their own precarious position when they saw the concern in their parents' faces and the way neighbors looked at them with pity. What made Emma's response to this understanding remarkable was not the understanding itself but what she chose to do with it. Rather than retreating into fear or despair, She decided to create something lasting. Her journal was her way of asserting that her life had meaning, that her observations and thoughts mattered, that she deserved to be remembered. In this sense, Emma's story transcended the specific circumstances of her time and place. It became a universal story about the human need to be seen, to be known, to leave some mark on the world that proves we existed. As Sarah delved deeper into the Thornton family history, she found that Emma's death had profound and lasting effects on those who survived her. Letters between Mary Thornton and her sister in Tennessee, discovered in another branch of the family's papers, revealed a woman devastated by grief. Mary wrote about how the house felt empty without Emma's quiet presence, how she found herself listening for the sound of pages turning as Emma read, how she could not bring herself to give away Emma's few possessions. Heinrich's grief was less openly expressed but equally profound. According to family accounts preserved in oral histories collected in the 1970s, Heinrich spent the year after Emma's death expanding his apple orchard significantly, planting hundreds of new trees. He told neighbors that he wanted the orchard to last for generations, to be something permanent that would outlive him. Family members later suggested that this obsessive planting was Heinrich's way of creating his own memorial, his own way of ensuring that something he created would persist, just as Emma had tried to ensure that her words would persist in her journal. Anna Thornton, Emma's older sister, married Thomas Mueller in 1894 and had 6 children of her own. She lived until 1957, reaching the age of 80. In her later years, she gave interviews to local historians about life in the Ozarks during her childhood. In one interview, conducted when she was 74 years old, Anna spoke about Emma for the first time publicly. "She was the smartest of all of us," Anna said. "Smarter than me, smarter than Johann. She saw things differently. She noticed things. Mama used to say that Emma had an old soul. I don't know about that. I just know that when she died, it felt like we lost something precious that we could never get back. The house was never the same after she was gone. None of us were ever quite the same." The journal itself had been preserved by Mary Thornton, who kept it in her personal trunk until her own death in 1919. It then passed to Anna, who kept it among her most cherished possessions but rarely looked at it, finding the memories too painful. When Anna died in 1957, the journal passed to her daughter Helen, then to Helen's daughter Margaret, the woman whose estate had eventually donated the family papers to the Springfield Historical Society. This chain of preservation was itself remarkable. Many personal papers and diaries from the 19th century were lost, destroyed, or thrown away as families moved and possessions were winnowed down through generations. That Emma's journal had survived for more than 130 years suggested that it had held special meaning for each generation that inherited it, even if they did not fully understand what made it so significant. Sarah worked to bring Emma's story to a wider audience through multiple channels. She published an academic article analyzing the journal in the context of children's literacy and historical consciousness in frontier America. She wrote a more accessible piece for a popular history magazine, focusing on Emma's remarkable self-awareness and her deliberate act of creating a record for the future. And she developed a museum exhibition at the Springfield Historical Society that displayed the journal, the photograph, and contextual materials about the Thornton family and life in the Ozarks during the 1890s. The exhibition opened in September, carefully timed to coincide with the anniversary month of the photograph's creation. The centerpiece was a large reproduction of the 1891 family portrait, with an interactive magnification tool that allowed visitors to zoom in and see the details that had initially captured Sarah's attention: Emma's downward gaze, her small hands cradling the journal, the intensity of her expression. Beside the photograph was the journal itself, open to one of Emma's most philosophical entries about writing and memory. And surrounding these central artifacts were objects that illustrated Emma's world: period clothing, farming implements, books like those Emma would have read, and photographs of the Ozark landscape that had been her daily view. What surprised Sarah was the emotional response the exhibition generated. She had expected interest from historians and academics, and indeed they came in numbers, drawn by the novelty of a well-preserved child's journal from such an early period. But ordinary visitors were equally moved. Parents came with their children and stood quietly before the photograph, reading Emma's words aloud. Elderly visitors shared their own stories about family members who had died young, ancestors whose lives had been brief but meaningful. Teachers brought school groups and used Emma's journal to talk about literacy, history, and the importance of documenting one's own experiences. One visitor left a comment in the exhibition's guest book that particularly resonated with Sarah. "I am a mother of 3 children." Looking at Emma's picture and reading her words, I am struck by how much she understood about life despite having so little time to live it. She knew that words could outlast us. She knew that being remembered mattered. She made a choice, at 7 years old, to create something that would last. How many adults have that kind of clarity about what's important? This little girl from 1891 has taught me something about living intentionally, about paying attention, about making sure the people we love know they matter. Thank you for sharing her story. Sarah also received communications from distant Thornton family members who had known little about Emma before the exhibition. One great-great-granddaughter of Anna Thornton flew in from California specifically to see the journal and photograph. She spent hours in the exhibition, reading every entry, examining every artifact. "I'm named Emma," she told Sarah. "My grandmother told me I was named after her great-aunt who died as a child, but she never told me this story. She never told me that little Emma wrote a journal. I wish I had known. I feel like I've just met a member of my family that I should have known all along." This idea of delayed recognition, of Emma finally being truly seen and known more than a century after her death, moved Sarah deeply. It validated her months of research and her insistence that Emma's story deserved to be told. But it also raised questions about how many other stories remained hidden in archives, waiting for someone to notice, to care, to bring them to light. How many other children had lived brief lives but left small traces of their thoughts and experiences, traces that had been overlooked or dismissed as insignificant? How many other voices from the past deserved to be heard? Sarah began expanding her research into other 19th century children's diaries and journals. She discovered that while Emma's journal was unusually well-preserved and philosophically sophisticated for a child so young, it was not entirely unique. There were other examples of children documenting their lives, their thoughts, and their awareness of mortality. But many of these documents existed only as mentions in family papers or catalog entries in archives, their significance unrecognized, their contents unexamined. She proposed a larger project, a comprehensive study and publication of children's voices from the 19th century American frontier. The project would identify, preserve, and contextualize diaries, journals, letters, and other writings by children, bringing their perspectives into the historical record in a systematic way. Emma's journal would serve as the centerpiece, but the broader project would demonstrate that children were not merely passive subjects of history but active observers and documentarians of their own experiences. The project found enthusiastic support from both academic institutions and public history organizations. Grants were secured, research assistants were hired, and Sarah found herself coordinating a multi-year effort to locate and preserve children's writings from across the American frontier. Each discovery brought new insights into how children understood their world, coped with hardship, imagined their futures, and, in too many cases, faced their own mortality with courage and awareness that seemed remarkable in one so young. But Emma's journal remained special, both to Sarah and to the growing number of people who encountered her story. Perhaps it was the photograph that made the difference, that visual record of Emma choosing to hold her journal rather than a doll or toy, choosing to look down at her own words rather than up at the camera. Perhaps it was the quality of Emma's writing, her unusual sophistication and self-awareness. Or perhaps it was simply the power of her final message, "Now you know I was here." In an age of digital immortality, when every thought can be posted online and every moment documented in photographs, Emma's simple determination to be remembered took on new relevance. She had lived in a time when most lives passed unrecorded, when ordinary people left barely a trace of their existence beyond census entries and gravestones. Yet Emma, given less than 9 years on Earth, had ensured that her thoughts, observations, and existence would be preserved. She had, in her own way, achieved exactly what she set out to do. The story of Emma Thornton and her journal might have remained a local historical curiosity, known only to academics and visitors to the Springfield Historical Society, if not for the unexpected attention it received in the digital age. A journalist writing a feature article about the exhibition shared a photograph of Emma's journal entry about writing for posterity. The image went viral on social media, shared hundreds of thousands of times within days, with users responding to the poignancy of a child's determination to be remembered. Comments and shares came from around the world. People related Emma's story to their own experiences with mortality, with leaving legacies, with the fundamental human need to matter. Teachers used the story in classrooms from Tokyo to Toronto, asking students to consider what they would write if they wanted future generations to know they had existed. Bloggers wrote reflective pieces about Emma's wisdom and the lessons her brief life offered. A children's book author even reached out to Sarah, asking permission to write a fictionalized account of Emma's life for young readers. This unexpected attention brought both opportunities and challenges. Sarah found herself fielding media requests, giving interviews to journalists and appearing on podcasts to discuss Emma's story and its relevance to contemporary audiences. The Historical Society saw a dramatic increase in visitors, with people traveling from across the country specifically to see the journal and photograph. Local schools incorporated Emma's story into their history curricula, and a middle school in Springfield organized a writing project where students created their own journals documenting what they observed and thought was important about their lives. But the increased attention also raised difficult questions about memory, representation, and the ethics of sharing intimate personal documents. Some critics argued that by displaying Emma's journal and broadcasting her story so widely, Sarah had violated the privacy of a child who could not consent to such exposure. Others suggested that the emotional response to Emma's story was a form of sentimentalism that distorted our understanding of history by focusing on individual tragedy rather than broader patterns and systems. Sarah took these criticisms seriously. She wrote a response piece for a history journal in which she acknowledged the ethical complexities of sharing personal documents, particularly those written by children. But she also argued that Emma herself had explicitly written for future readers, that she had deliberately included her journal in the family photograph to ensure it would be documented and remembered. Emma wanted to be known, Sarah wrote. She was clear about this. Honoring her wish does not violate her privacy. It fulfills her express purpose in writing. And while we must always be thoughtful about how we share historical documents, particularly those involving children, we also have a responsibility to listen to voices from the past that specifically asked to be heard. The debate prompted Sarah to think more deeply about what Emma's story meant and why it resonated so powerfully with contemporary audiences. She concluded that the appeal lay in Emma's combination of vulnerability and agency. Emma was undeniably a victim of circumstances beyond her control. The historical accident of being born before effective medical treatments existed, the poverty and isolation that characterized frontier life, the bacteria that invaded her lungs and slowly destroyed them. Yet within those constraints, Emma had exercised remarkable agency. She could not control her fate, but she could control how she responded to it. She chose to observe, to document, to create something that would outlast her brief life. This combination spoke to fundamental human experiences that transcended time and place. Everyone faces limitations. Everyone confronts mortality eventually, whether as an abstract future fact or as an immediate reality. And everyone must decide how to respond to these limitations, with despair or determination, with passivity or purpose. Emma's choice to write, to create, to ensure she would be remembered offered a model of resilience that people found inspiring across generational and cultural boundaries. Sarah also realized that Emma's story gained additional power from the historical distance. Emma had been dead for more than 130 years. Everyone who had known her personally, who had loved her and mourned her, was also long dead. The immediate rawness of her death had been softened by the passage of time into something more universal and archetypal. People could engage with Emma's story without the overwhelming weight of fresh grief, could find inspiration and meaning in her determination without feeling that they were exploiting someone's immediate loss. Yet the story remained deeply personal for those who connected to it most strongly. Sarah received hundreds of letters and emails from people sharing their own experiences. Parents wrote about children they had lost to illness or accident, finding comfort in knowing that Emma's parents had also endured such loss and somehow continued living. People with terminal illnesses wrote about their own struggles to create meaning and leave something behind. Teachers described students who had been inspired by Emma's journal to start keeping their own records of their thoughts and observations. One letter particularly moved Sarah. It came from a woman named Jennifer Hartwell, who explained that she was a great-great-granddaughter of J. Hartwell, the traveling photographer who had taken the Thornton family portrait in 1891. Jennifer had discovered Sarah's research while searching for information about her ancestors' work and had been amazed to learn the story behind one of his photographs. Jennifer explained that J. Hartwell had been a German immigrant like Heinrich Thornton, and that he had traveled throughout the Ozarks for nearly 40 years, documenting families and communities. Many of his glass plate negatives had survived, preserved by his descendants and eventually donated to various historical archives. But until Jennifer encountered Sarah's work, no one had known the stories behind most of the faces in those photographs. They were simply anonymous images of long-dead people, interesting as artifacts of photographic technique and historical fashion but lacking the personal narratives that made them meaningful. Reading about Emma, Jennifer wrote, made me realize that every one of my great-great-grandfather's photographs represents a person with a story, with hopes and fears and thoughts we can never fully know. Emma is the one whose story we can know because she wrote it down and because you found it and shared it. But all the others mattered too. They all wanted to be remembered. The photographs themselves were acts of commemoration, families spending precious money to create a record of their existence. Your work has changed how I look at those old photographs. I don't just see historical artifacts anymore. I see people who wanted to be remembered, just like Emma. This insight deepened Sarah's understanding of why the photograph had been so central to her discovery of Emma's story. The journal alone would have been a remarkable find, a child's voice from the past speaking directly about her experiences and thoughts. But the photograph transformed it into something more. The image showed Emma making an active choice to document her journal, to ensure that the object she considered most important would be recorded for posterity. The photograph and the journal together became a powerful statement about memory, preservation, and the human need to be known. Sarah began giving presentations about Emma's story at historical conferences and museums across the country. She always included high-resolution images of the photograph, allowing audiences to see what she had seen: Emma's downward gaze, her hands cradling the journal, the intensity of her focus. And she always read aloud from Emma's entries, letting Emma's own words speak across the years. Audiences consistently responded to certain passages. Emma's philosophical reflections on beauty and observation resonated with people who worked in creative fields. Her descriptions of the natural world captivated environmental historians and nature writers. Her awareness of her own mortality and her determination to create something lasting moved anyone who had faced serious illness or loss. And her final entry, "Now you know I was here," never failed to leave audiences in thoughtful silence. Through these presentations, Sarah began to understand that Emma's story was doing more than just adding one voice to the historical record. It was changing how people thought about children in history, demonstrating that young people could be sophisticated observers and documentarians of their own experiences. It was illustrating the power of primary sources to make history personal and immediate rather than abstract and distant. And it was raising important questions about whose voices get preserved in the historical record and why. These questions led Sarah to a disturbing realization. Emma's journal had survived because she came from a relatively prosperous family that valued literacy and preservation, because her writings were kept by family members who recognized their significance, and because those papers eventually found their way to a professional archive where they were cared for and made accessible. But how many other children had lived and died in the 19th century, perhaps with equal insight and determination, whose thoughts went unrecorded because they had no access to paper and pencils? How many children's writings had been discarded as unimportant? How many voices had been silenced not by death but by poverty, by lack of education, by systematic exclusion from literacy? Sarah began investigating these questions, looking for examples of children's writings from marginalized communities. She found a few examples. A letter from an enslaved child separated from family members, a diary kept by a Native American girl attending a boarding school, scattered writings by immigrant children documenting their family struggles. But these were heartbreakingly rare. The historical record was not neutral. It preserved the voices of some people while erasing others, not because those erased voices had nothing to say but because systems of inequality had denied them the tools and opportunities to be heard. This realization complicated but ultimately enriched Sarah's understanding of Emma's story. Emma had been privileged in certain ways. Her family valued education, she had access to books and writing materials, her father could afford to hire a teacher. Yet she had also been profoundly vulnerable, living with a terminal illness in a time and place where medical care was primitive. Her determination to be remembered emerged from this complex intersection of privilege and vulnerability, opportunity and constraint. By the exhibition's second anniversary, it had become one of the Historical Society's most popular permanent displays. School groups visited regularly, often spending hours reading Emma's entries and discussing what they would write if they wanted to be remembered. The Society had created an interactive component where visitors could contribute to a digital journal, sharing their own observations and thoughts about what mattered to them. Over time, this grew into a rich collection of contemporary voices echoing Emma's impulse to document and preserve. Sarah continued her research into other children's writings, but Emma remained the heart of her work. She published a book-length study that placed Emma's journal in the broader context of American childhood, literacy, and mortality in the 19th century. The book was both scholarly and accessible, combining rigorous historical analysis with sensitive storytelling that honored Emma's voice and perspective. Reviews praised Sarah's ability to balance emotional engagement with intellectual rigor, to make readers care about Emma while also understanding the larger patterns her story illuminated. Perhaps the most profound validation of Sarah's work came from an unexpected source. A graduate student named Maya Rodriguez contacted Sarah about incorporating Emma's story into her dissertation on children's agency and historical consciousness. Maya was particularly interested in how Emma's journal demonstrated a child's sophisticated understanding of time, memory, and legacy. She argued that Emma's determination to create a written record revealed a form of historical thinking that challenged assumptions about children's cognitive development and their capacity for abstract thought about the future. Maya's research led her to compare Emma's journal with other examples of children's writings from different time periods and cultures. She found that while Emma's circumstances were unique, her impulse to document her life and thoughts was not. Children throughout history and across cultures had, when given the opportunity, recorded their observations, feelings, and ideas. This pattern suggested something fundamental about human development and consciousness, that even young children understood the passage of time, anticipated the future, and sought ways to extend their influence beyond the immediate present. The conversation with Maya reminded Sarah of why Emma's story had captured her imagination so completely 3 years earlier. It wasn't just the poignancy of a child facing death, though that was certainly moving. It was the evidence of a sophisticated mind at work, a young person grappling with profound questions about meaning, memory, and mortality. Emma had not simply accepted her fate. She had actively engaged with it, using the tools available to her, literacy, observation, determination, to create something that would outlast her limited time on Earth. As Sarah prepared for a presentation at a national history conference, she found herself returning again and again to the photograph that had started everything. She had looked at that image hundreds of times by now, had studied every detail until she knew it by heart. But it still moved her, that glimpse of a little girl from 1891 holding her journal with such focus and intensity. Emma had succeeded in what she set out to do. People did know she had been here. Her words had survived. Her thoughts had reached across more than a century to touch thousands of lives. I end her presentation. Sarah concluded with a reflection that had evolved through 3 years of living with Emma's story. We often think about history as the study of important people and major events. We write about presidents and generals, wars and revolutions, economic systems and social movements. These are legitimate and necessary subjects. But history is also the accumulated experience of ordinary people living ordinary lives, and sometimes those ordinary people do extraordinary things. Emma Thornton was an ordinary child from an ordinary farming family in rural Missouri. But she recognized something profound, that life is fleeting, that memory is fragile, that being known and remembered matters. And she did something about it. She wrote. She documented. She created a record. And she made sure that record would be preserved by including it in a family photograph. These were not grand gestures. They were the quiet, determined actions of a child who understood that words could outlast us and that being remembered was a form of immortality available even to those with no power or wealth or fame. Emma's story reminds us that everyone has a story worth telling, that every voice matters, and that paying attention to the quiet, often overlooked details of history can reveal profound truths about what it means to be human. The audience responded with sustained applause, and several people approached Sarah afterward to share their own connections to Emma's story. A museum curator wanted to discuss creating a traveling exhibition. A filmmaker was interested in developing a documentary. An author of historical fiction asked permission to write a novel inspired by Emma's life. Each conversation represented another way that Emma's voice would continue to reach new audiences, fulfilling her hope to be remembered in ways she could never have imagined when she wrote those final words in February 1892. That evening, Sarah sat alone in her hotel room, thinking about the journey that had begun with a simple photograph in a dusty archive box. She thought about Emma, about the child's fierce determination and her gentle observations. She thought about the Thornton family, about parents who had buried 2 children and somehow found the strength to continue living. She thought about all the people who had been moved by Emma's story, who had seen in it reflections of their own experiences with loss, love, and the search for meaning, and she thought about the small leather journal preserved in its climate-controlled case at the Historical Society, pages yellowed with age but words still clear, still readable, still speaking. Emma had wanted someone to know she had been here. Now thousands of people knew. Her life had been brief, only 8 years and 5 months. But her impact had extended far beyond those few years. Through her words, Emma Thornton had achieved exactly what she had hoped for. She had made sure that her existence mattered, that her observations were preserved, that someone in the future would know she had lived and paid attention and tried to make sense of the world she inhabited. The photograph, that 1891 portrait of the Thornton family, hung in reproduction on museum walls now, viewed by countless visitors who paused to read Emma's story. And in that image, Emma sat on her small stool, holding her journal with small hands, her gaze directed downward to the words she had written, oblivious to the camera and the photographer and the century and more of time that would pass before someone finally noticed, finally understood, finally brought her voice into the light. Emma Thornton had been here. Now we all knew it. And we would not forget.